Abel Granger pressed his thumb into the split seam of his daughter's winter coat and thought about what kind of man lets a child go cold. Not a good one. That much was plain. He stood in the yard behind the farmhouse, the October sky pale as old bone above the Idaho hills, and the coat in his hands was the third thing this week that had come apart without warning. The fence by the creek, Clara's left boot heel, and now this. He was running out of things he knew how to fix. The letter from the Hartwell Domestic Agency sat folded on the kitchen table inside. He'd read it twice and set it down and read it again, the way a man does when the words don't arrange themselves into comfort. They had a candidate, the letter said, qualified, experienced with children. But there was a note, a careful, apologetic note, from the agency clerk, a Mr. Pitts, who wrote that he felt it his duty to advise Mr. Granger that the woman in question was perhaps more educated than the position strictly required. She had been a school teacher in Ohio. She had studied 2 years at a women's seminary. She held opinions, Mr. Pitts wrote, with a tone suggesting this was a character flaw, on the proper rearing of children. Abel read that last part a third time. Then he folded the letter and went out to find the coat. He was not an educated man. He could read well enough, cipher well enough, knew the land under his boots the way a man knows his own face in a wash basin mirror. He had built this house himself, plank by plank, after the fever took Eleanor 3 years ago and left him with a daughter who was 4 years old and grieving in a way that children grieve. Quietly, in corners, holding a rag doll and waiting for something to make sense again. Clara was 7 now. She needed more than he alone could give her. He held the coat up against the pale sky and looked through the split seam at the light beyond it. The agency wanted an answer by Friday. He went inside and picked up his pen. Abigail Morse arrived on the Thursday train from Boise with a single trunk, a canvas satchel, and the particular expression of a woman who has decided not to be afraid of anything she has not yet seen. She was 31 years old. She was not pretty in the way that stopped a room, but she had a quality of steadiness about her face, gray eyes that looked at a thing carefully before deciding what they thought of it, and a mouth that sat in a line until it had reason to do otherwise. She wore her brown hair coiled at the nape of her neck, and her coat was good wool, a little thin at the elbows, mended neatly. She had mended it herself. The station master told her Mr. Granger's farm was 4 miles north, and that he'd send word when she arrived. She said she would wait on the bench outside. She waited for 40 minutes in the cold without complaint, watching the hills above Silver Creek turn color in the afternoon light, and she thought about what she was doing here, and whether it was brave or simply necessary. She had lost her position at the school in Millfield when the new board decided that unmarried women of a certain age gave the wrong impression to the pupils. She had spent 3 months after that living with her cousin in Boise and trying not to feel like a problem to be solved. The agency had found her the Granger position, and she had taken it without meeting the man, which was the sort of thing you did when the alternative was becoming someone's charity case. Abel's wagon came up the road with a clatter that scared a magpie from the fence post. He climbed down without ceremony, a tall man going a little lean in the way that men go lean when they work hard and eat last, and he took off his hat. He had dark eyes and a jaw that had not been introduced to a razor since Monday, and he looked at her the way she had looked at the hills, carefully, deciding what he thought. "Miss Morse," he said. "Mr. Granger," she said. There was a pause in which they both understood that the terms had not been settled, and that settling them before anything else was the honest thing to do. She opened her satchel and produced the agency contract. He produced his copy. They stood at the tailgate of the wagon in the October wind and went through it line by line, which was not romantic but was something better. It was fair. The arrangement was simple. She would keep the house and care for Clara in exchange for room, board, and a small wage. She had asked, through the agency, that the wage be paid monthly rather than at year's end, and he had agreed to that without argument, which told her something useful about him. She asked now, directly, whether he had any particular rules about the running of the household. He thought for a moment. "The child eats first," he said. "Everything else, we figure as we go." She put her copy of the contract back in the satchel. "That suits me," she said. He loaded her trunk into the wagon, and they drove north through the colored hills, and did not speak much, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people with their own serious thoughts who did not feel the need to paper over them. Clara was waiting on the porch when the wagon came up the track. She was a small, dark-haired child with her father's eyes and a seriousness about her that sat oddly on a 7-year-old's face, the way an old book looks sitting on a new shelf. She watched Abigail climb down from the wagon and held the porch rail with both hands and said nothing. Abigail did not rush at her. She did not crouch down with exaggerated warmth or make the cooing sounds that some adults made at children, as if children were a species that required special management. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Clara honestly. "You must be Clara," she said. "My name is Abigail. Your father has been kind enough to offer me the room on the north side. I hope that's agreeable to you." Clara considered this for a long moment. "Do you know how to make biscuits?" she asked. "I do," Abigail said, "though I have not made them in this kitchen, so the first batch may need improvement." "Papa burns them," Clara said, with the pitiless accuracy of a 7-year-old. "I burn them on the bottom," Abel said from behind Abigail, his voice carrying no injury. "Most people do," Abigail said, which for some reason made Clara almost smile. The house was plain and clean in the way of houses where a man has done his level best with no gift for domesticity. The floors were swept, but the curtains were wrong for the windows, too narrow, bunched to one side. The pantry held beans, salt pork, flour, and very little else. The table had 3 chairs, one of which wobbled. Abigail looked at all of it and felt something in her settle that had been restless for a long time. That first evening she made a pot of bean soup with the salt pork and the dried thyme she found on the back of the pantry shelf, and she made cornbread in the cast-iron skillet because the biscuit flour needed replenishing. Clara sat at the table and watched her work with the focused attention of someone learning a skill. Abigail narrated as she went, not performing, just explaining. How much salt, why you don't rush the cornbread's crust, what the smell means when it's ready. She had taught children for 8 years, and she knew that explaining was a form of respect. Abel came in from the barn when the light was nearly gone, and he stopped in the doorway for a moment before he came to the table, as if the smell of cooked food had surprised him. They ate. It was a quiet meal, but not an empty one. Clara ate 2 bowls of soup and most of the cornbread. Abel ate steadily and said, when he had finished, that it was good. Abigail thanked him simply. No performance on either side. That economy of expression, she was learning, was how he lived. When Clara was in bed, Abigail sat at the kitchen table with the household ledger Abel set in front of her, and they went through it together, item by item. The farm owed money to the merchant's bank in Silver Creek. Not an emergency sum, but a persistent one. The winter stores were thin. She wrote a list of what the pantry needed and what it could wait on, and she asked about the kitchen garden and whether it had been put to bed yet or only neglected. Neglected, he said, which cost him something to admit. "I can put it right before the ground freezes," she said. "It wants a few days." He looked at the list she had made. It was organized by urgency and then by cost, which was more system than he had applied to the matter himself. "You don't have to do that," he said. "That wasn't in the contract." "The contract said I keep the house," she said. "The garden belongs to the house." He looked at her for a moment. She met his gaze directly without challenge, simply stating a thing that seemed obvious to her. He nodded. She blew out the lamp at 8:30 and went to bed, and the house settled around her, and she slept better than she had in months. November came in behind a skin of ice on the creek and a wind that found every gap in the farmhouse walls and made itself known. Abigail spent the first week learning where the gaps were, not complaining about them but locating them, stuffing them with rags and oiled paper, moving the understanding of this house from the abstract to the particular. She rehung the curtains so they covered the windows properly. She found a box of Eleanor's things in the back of the linen press, and she asked Abel before touching them, and he said after a long moment that she could set them aside. He'd deal with them, and she moved them carefully to the high shelf in the bedroom closet without saying anything further about it. The wobbling chair she braced herself with a wedge of scrap pine from the wood pile. Abel came in one evening, sat down in it, and looked underneath it without speaking. He looked at her. She was at the stove. She didn't say anything. He went back to the barn and came back an hour later with a proper joint pin and set the chair right for good, because he was that kind of man. If you started a repair, he finished it. Clara had begun to orbit her. That was the only word for it. She appeared in the kitchen in the mornings before Abigail had the stove going, wrapped in her quilt, sitting on the bench near the door and watching with her serious eyes. She asked questions in a steady stream. Why do you knead bread like that? Why do you pin your hair that way? Why does the sky get pink before snow? Abigail answered all of them with the same care she would have given a bright pupil, which Clara was, without question. One afternoon, Abigail found an old primer on the high shelf above the fireplace and brought it down and dusted it and set it on the table. Clara climbed up onto the bench and they read it together for an hour, Abigail pointing to the words and letting Clara sound them. The child could already read simple sentences. Abel had taught her, but she was hungry for more than the primer held. By the end of the week, Abigail had written out 20 new words on a slate she found in the linen chest, and Clara was copying them with a concentration that made the tip of her tongue show between her teeth. Abel watched this from the doorway one evening without announcing himself. He stood there long enough to see Clara read back 4 words in a row without help, and then he went back to the barn. That night he told Abigail that she didn't have to spend her free time on lessons. She said she didn't consider it spending. He said nothing to that. But 2 days later a new reader appeared on the table, a McGuffey's, 2nd edition, and it had come from town, and he had gone to town alone. The threat came from town the way most threats did out here, dressed in polite language and signed at the bottom with a banker's name. A letter arrived in the 3rd week of November from a man named Harlow Fitch, who represented the Silver Creek Land Improvement Company, and who wanted Abel to know that his water rights on the Eastern Creek Channel, the channel that fed the farm's kitchen garden and the stock trough, were, upon careful legal review, a matter of some uncertainty, and that the company would be grateful for Mr. Granger's cooperative response at his earliest convenience. Abel read the letter at the table after supper. His face did not change, but his hands, Abigail noticed, went flat on the table in the way that hands do when a man is choosing not to make them into fists. She asked if she might read it. He passed it to her without comment. She read it twice. The language was careful and full of cushioned threats, the kind of writing she recognized from her time in Ohio, where the seminary board had written similarly gracious letters before informing her colleagues that their positions were no longer available. Polite words used as instruments. "This is a pressure letter," she said. "They don't have the rights, or they would have said so plainly. They're hoping you'll respond out of worry and offer something before you've checked the record." He looked at her with a new attention, as if he was revising something. "How do you know that?" "I read a great deal," she said, "including my father's business correspondence, when he let me." She set the letter down. "Do you have the original deed? The water claim would be attached." He went to the cabinet in the corner of the main room and came back with a tin box. Inside were the land deed and the water rights claim, filed with the territorial office in 1887. clear and dated and attached by the proper stamp. She read it and then read it again, and then pointed to the section that described the Eastern Channel by its survey markers. "This is yours," she said. "Has been since 1887. They're hoping you don't know that." Abel looked at the deed. He had seen it before, of course, but legal language had a way of obscuring its own plain meaning. Now that she read it back to him in plain words, it was obvious. He was quiet for a moment. "The bank holds the mortgage," he said. "Fitch works with the same bank." "Then you write back," she said. "Politely. You cite the deed by date and survey number, and you thank him for his interest, and you say the matter is settled to your satisfaction. You don't offer anything. You don't apologize. You simply state the record." "You could write it," he said. It was not a question, but it was not quite an order. "I could," she said, "if you want me to." "I want you to," he said. She wrote the letter that evening while Clara slept. It was 2 paragraphs, measured and exact, with the survey numbers and the filing date and a tone of complete untroubled confidence. She read it to him when she finished. He listened with his arms folded and his head slightly bent, and when she was done he said that it was good. He signed it. They sent it with the Friday post. Fitch did not write back. The silence from the Land Improvement Company was the best answer they could have received, and Abel understood that in a way that required no ceremony. But something had shifted. He knew it and she knew it, though neither said so directly. She had stood between his family and a threat, and she had done it with a sharpened pencil and a mind that saw straight through careful language to the plain thing underneath. He began to notice after that the way she moved through the house, not timidly, not performing comfort, but with a settled authority that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with care. She belonged here in the way that the stove belonged here, in the way that the sound of her voice reading to Clara in the evenings belonged here, low and steady as a lamp. He had not let himself think of Eleanor without guilt for a long time. He thought of her now, not with guilt but with a kind of honest grief that had cleared itself of blame. Eleanor would have liked Abigail. That thought arrived quietly and stayed. December sealed the farm in white. The first real snow came overnight and lay across the fields in the still, clean way of snow that intends to stay. And when Abigail opened the kitchen door in the morning, the world had changed its dimensions. Everything was closer: the barn roof, the fence line, the dark shape of the pine windbreak to the north. Clara appeared at her elbow in her nightgown and stared out at it. "Can we go?" she asked. "After breakfast," Abigail said, "and after you are dressed properly. All of it, both mittens." She was mending the split seam on Clara's winter coat when Abel came in from morning chores, stamping snow from his boots. He stopped when he saw the coat in her hands. "I meant to get to that," he said. "It's done," she said. She bit the thread and held the coat up. The seam was straight and tight, reinforced at both ends. He took the coat from her and turned it in his hands, and she could not entirely read the expression on his face, but it carried something that looked like relief, of a kind that went further than the coat. He handed it back without speaking. She helped Clara into it, and tied the collar buttons and sent her out into the snow with her father, watching them from the doorway, the tall man and the small dark-haired girl making the first tracks across the white field. She watched until the cold drove her back inside, and then she put the kettle on and sat down and did not move for a little while. That evening, after Clara was in bed, Abel came to the kitchen and stood in the way he had developed of standing near the table when he had something to say, and was working his way toward it. Abigail poured him coffee and sat down and waited without filling the silence. "The agency," he said finally. "They'll want a report, whether the arrangement is satisfactory." "I expect so," she said. "Is it?" he said. "Satisfactory?" "To you." She looked at him carefully. This was not what he was actually asking, and they both knew it. But she answered the surface question first, because it was true. "Yes," she said. Very much so. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. The fire was low. The wind moved outside the window and the lamp flickered and settled. "Pitts at the agency," he said, "wrote me that you were too educated for this position." "I know," she said. "He wrote me something similar, that the position might not suit my attainments." She said it without rancor. "Do you think he was right?" Abel asked. She thought about the mended coat, the letter that had silenced Fitch, the 20 words on the slate that Clara had read back in a clear, small voice, the garden she had put to bed before the freeze, and that would come back green in April. She thought about the chair that now sat level on the kitchen floor, and the curtains that covered the windows, and the sound this house made at night when all 3 of them were inside it. "No," she said, "I don't think he was right." Abel set the coffee cup down. He looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at her. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Past the contract. He stopped. He tried again. "I want Clara to have what she has now. I want—" Another stop. He was not a man who had the words for want laid ready to hand. She watched him with steady gray eyes and did not rescue him, because this was his to say. "I'd like the arrangement to be permanent," he said at last. "If you're willing. I know that's a different thing than what we agreed to, and I won't hold you to anything you don't choose." The lamplight was kind on his face. He looked, she thought, younger than the land had worn him. Or not younger, but truer, the way a stone looks when the dust is off it. "Ask me plainly," she said quietly. "Not cruelty, honesty." He raised his eyes to hers. "Will you marry me, Abigail?" She did not say yes immediately. She sat with it for a moment, the way she sat with anything that mattered, turning it carefully and looking at all its sides. Then she said, "Yes, I will." And because she was who she was, she added, "I'll want to discuss the terms in the morning." That made him almost smile. It was the first time she had seen that, the almost smile, and it rearranged something in her. The next morning Abel was at the stove when Abigail came downstairs, and the coffee was made badly, but it was made, which counted. Clara appeared before either of them had said good morning, and climbed onto the bench and looked at Abigail across the table with those serious dark eyes and said, without preamble, "Are you going to stay forever?" Abigail looked at Abel. He was watching her over his coffee cup. "Yes," she said. "I am." Clara nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already decided. "Good," she said, "because I told Mrs. Hendricks at the post that you were going to be my mother, and she said I shouldn't say things I didn't know, but I knew." Abel made a sound that might have been a cough. Abigail looked at the table and composed herself with some effort. Then she looked up at Clara and said, "You were right, and you may tell Mrs. Hendricks so if you like." Clara appeared to consider the pleasure of this for a moment. "I will," she said solemnly. After breakfast. The preacher came out on a Saturday in February when the snow was still on the ground, but the light had shifted its angle. The particular light of late winter in Idaho. That means the season is not finished with you, but it is at least thinking about it. He married them in the front room of the farmhouse with Clara standing between them, holding Abigail's hand on one side and her father's on the other, serving as a witness of uncertain legal standing, but complete personal authority. There were no rings yet. Abel had ordered them from the catalog and they were coming. But the preacher said the words and they said their words back, and it was done, and it was real, and it was chosen by both of them with open eyes. Abel built a new shelf in the kitchen that spring. He had not said he was going to do it. He had simply measured the wall one evening and come back 2 days later with the lumber, and Abigail had stood in the doorway and watched him plane it smooth, and she had understood without words that the shelf was not for cups or tins. It was for books. He set it at a height that Clara could reach in another year or 2. There were 3 books on it now. There would be more. When the shelf was up and level, Abel stepped back and looked at it, and then at Abigail, and she said it was good, and she meant more than the shelf, and he knew that, and he nodded once in that way of his, and that was sufficient. The wind came through the valley the way it always did, persistent and purposeful, carrying the smell of pine and turned earth and the far-off cold of the mountains that would never entirely go away. But inside the house the lamp was lit and the stove was warm, and Clara was on the bench reading the McGuffies aloud to the cat, who was tolerating the lesson. Abel sat at the table with his ledger, and Abigail sat across from him with her mending, and outside the world was what it was, large and indifferent and sometimes hard. And inside this house there was a family that had been built by axe and not by accident, and that was more than either of them had thought to ask for, and it was enough, and it was good. There are things in this life that arrive wrapped in practicality, a letter, a contract, a wagon ride in October wind, and only later do you recognize them for what they truly were. Providence. A hand extended at exactly the right moment. Abigail Morse came to that farm because she needed a place to stand, and Abel Granger opened the door because his daughter needed more than one pair of hands could give. But what grew inside those walls was never in any contract. It was built the way all real things are built, slowly, honestly, one act of care at a time. Maybe you have known a kindness like that yourself, something that came to you plain and practical, and turned out to be the very thing your heart required. We would love to hear your story in the comments below. What small, unlikely moment changed the shape of your life? And if these Old West tales speak to something in you, please subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We have more journeys waiting, just around the next bend in the road. Good night. God bless you, each and every one.